Welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Stephen Roy Goodman. I'm here at Ulster University in Belfast, Northern Ireland, where we're going to be speaking about peace and conflict studies. And I've got with me two guests today, Brendan Hamber, who's a professor of peace and conflict studies at Ulster and also an alum of the university, and Catherine Ferrin, who's an alum of the university, of the master's program at the university, who also uses drama as a way of promoting peace and dealing with conflict. Is peace simply the absence of war, an absence of conflict? What is peace?
So it's a good question, and it's actually quite a hard question to answer, as you mentioned. I think in simple terms, we can think of peace as the absence of destructive violence or destructive conflict, or maybe a state of harmony. But generally in the field, we also think of it as a negative peace or a positive peace. So a negative peace might be that there actually is an absence of war, an absence of conflict, an absence of destruction, but there might still be underlying issues, say racism, inequality. So that we'd think of as a negative peace, whereas a positive peace might be the absence of war, the absence of conflict, but with those underlying issues also addressed. So we often make that distinction between the negative and the positive.
And those underlying issues, I'm assuming, Catherine, that's what you're addressing when you're working with individuals to try to make sure that there is more peace within their relationships with each other?
Yes, it's to do really with the structural and cultural negative peace that we are with in our homes between adults and adult relationships. My background would be domestic and sexual violence, and I would use then my experience and skills using drama then to not just one-to-one but also to groups and cross-community groups to raise awareness around the complexities of unhealthy relationships where there's coercive control and where there's conflict.
So then there's the issue of the conflict within the home and the issues in society. So I don't know which way to start first. So I guess within the home, is it hard for people to be at peace in society if they're not at peace at home?
I would say any conflict, even within the self, the conflict that we have with ourselves in how we see ourselves and our self-talk, we learn that as we're growing up and how we're brought up and taught how to think about ourselves. I think it starts there, but it doesn't mean then that that person will be in a relationship where there's conflict or in a community where there's conflict. But I think if someone is in conflict with themselves, then they see the world through conflict eyes and everything that touches. So my work is really about raising people's self-esteem, how to look at anger versus aggression, and all the elements and complexities of what conflict or violence is. But conflict isn't always a negative thing either. So sometimes conflict's there for us to grow. Sometimes conflict's there for things to be resolved rather than being hidden and held to fester. So it's to look at all of those things through the creative arts, for example.
Well, that's interesting. In terms of Northern Ireland, maybe I could throw this to both of you, in terms of Northern Ireland, where to say that peace has been elusive to a certain extent, how have the arts been part of that, and what efforts are you now making to make sure that peace, or at least an absence of conflict, exists in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think the arts has always played some sort of a role here. I mean, it's been a vehicle for people to express their frustrations, whether it's through music, whether it's through theatre. So it's often a vehicle to do that. It can be a vehicle for protest in many ways, but the arts can also be a vehicle for reconstruction in very real terms. So if we look at a city like Belfast, the growth of the art sector, the Game of Thrones being filmed here, that's been important for the economy, and the economy is important for peace. So you can think of it in a whole lot of different types of ways. And then, as Catherine said, it can also be an individually transformative process where you get to know yourself through the arts, whether it's as an observer or someone who's taking part in it, or in Catherine's work, where you're actually a participant, say, in a theatre production about some difficult issue.
Well, let's get to that theatre production of a difficult issue. So if there is a play down the street about a difficult issue, how do you make sure, one, that it's presented in a quote-unquote fair way, and how do you get bodies into the theater to actually hear that story or that conflict or that discussion?
Okay, my work is usually done through my activism and my network that I built up over the last 25 years. So it's not so much a theatre, but it could be a conference room, a seminar, a workshop where drama is used. However, there are organisations that do put performances on, and writers have written great pieces, for example, around the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. It's called Agreement. I went to see it, and what was wonderful about that was in one of our city's beautiful theatres, the Lyric. And what I found out about how drama really works for me that day was everyone my age and maybe 20 years younger will know the conversations that happened throughout that whole process coming up to that agreement, that accord. But what we saw through the writing and the performances was the personalities and the communication between the politicians. Now, a lot of it was funny. There was a lot of humour in it. But people went away laughing at them and ourselves, but also celebrating the achievement that it's brought regards to peace. So it depends on where the work is coming from. And people will go to a play or a performance where there's well-known actors, for example, so they use the normal way of getting people bums on seats, as it were. But through my work, it's usually a commission or an invitation. And it's about educating and raising awareness as opposed to a night out with popcorn.
But if you don't mind me pressing you on this a little bit, it seems to me that the people who probably need the most help are the people who are probably least resistant to having you come to their conference room or going to that performance of Agreement or something else.
Okay. Yes, well, the first time I was asked to write a piece around inter-community coercive control around paramilitarism was from an organisation in Northern Ireland called Training for Women Network. And they were rolling out a programme called Women in Community Transformation. So this was around women living in communities, building capacity, leadership, on all of those lovely skills that they can learn. But they knew the elephant in the room, the obstacle to women accessing these classes or this information or these education forms was that constriction of that element within their community. So they asked me to write a piece to depict how that impacts a woman, and my piece is called Sarah's Story. It's a 20-minute monologue, and it shows how that impact of that keeping silent, not being able to speak, not being able to share what you feel within a relationship and also within the community. So it happened through that way. And then the audience who safely watched this happen recognised Sarah and what was going on, either from their own experience or from people within their community, could safely then afterwards ask questions or make comments about Sarah. And so the conversation then began. And you can't underestimate how powerful that invitation to have a conversation was, the impact on those women who were then able to discuss things through the lens of the performance safely.
And Brandon, would you try to do something like that in a classroom as well, or is it harder to do in a classroom to do something like that because you might not be able to create Sarah on a set?
Well, I think one of the things for us, we're a peace and conflict studies program in a society that's divided, where there is a conflict ongoing. So you can't really ignore it. Now, of course, we look at wider conflicts as well, but there's a conflict in our backyard. So we're always bringing in those diverse stories, just sort of de facto, so we would bring in guest speakers, maybe not Sarah, but somebody who might tell their story, or a former combatant or a victim of the conflict. So you can bring those stories into the classroom, I think, in quite a different way. Or we'd, jump in a bus and drive around the city or take a walk. So in some ways it's easier for us to bring multiple voices in. I guess as an educator, one wouldn't want to necessarily manipulate that one way or another. We sort of see our role as just bringing those voices into the classroom and then seeing what people do with them.
And what about developing the skills of people who are trying to be peacemakers? I mean, how do you teach people to do that?
Yeah, and it's a real challenge for us because obviously learning to be a negotiator or a mediator is a very specific skill, and our course doesn't really teach you those skills. I think what we focus on, however, is developing your capacity to apply those skills so that when you look at a conflict, you can start to, in the way that we started this interview, oh, is this a negative piece? Is this a positive piece? Are we dealing with structural problems here? Are we dealing with cultural problems? Are we dealing with behavioral problems? So we work with the students to sort of help them really understand the dynamics of conflict. And then we can do that in quite practical ways. We say to them, right, take a conflict and write us an analysis of that conflict and write us a set of recommendations on how you might deal with that. Or practically, we'd have an assignment where we'd say, write a submission to government on a specific issue that you would like to see resolved and write it in the style of a submission. So we try and, I guess we'd call it an applied form of knowledge rather than sitting down and saying, right, now I'm going to teach you how to negotiate, or I'm going to teach you some skills about mediation. So we're developing the capacity, and the application is how I would think about it.
And in terms of that capacity, would somebody with your accent or my accent have a better chance of success here in Ulster? So I'm American, you're South African originally, but we're coming to Belfast from the outside. So would somebody coming from the outside of Belfast have an advantage in that, or not necessarily?
You'd have an initial advantage in the sense that people might look at you and sort of think, oh, you're not part of this community or you're not part of that community. But I think that only lasts so long. I think the students probably measure you more on what you bring into the classroom. So I would like to think, because I'm from South Africa, I bring a different perspective to the conflict. Likewise, if you're from the United States, you're going to bring a different perspective. So from my side, I think that's probably what, you could ask Catherine, but I would think that's probably what they would value more than he's a neutral guy, because I think that only goes sort of so far.
And I was going to ask Catherine that. And Catherine, so you grew up in Belfast. Mm-hmm. So when you're dealing with issues of the conflict, people must certainly try to figure out where you were from, what part of Belfast, and what your family background is like before they engage with you and your drama work.
I think it happens because we're conditioned to do it. I myself know that there's a filter that's already there that I do. It's more out of habit as opposed to a necessity, where I would maybe feel in fear because I don't. But a lot of my work is cross-community. That's women from the Protestant and the Catholic community and others now that Belfast is changing, with all different ethnic minorities living here, which is wonderful. So I think there is a little bit of that, and I do feel that conflict, that pull. So for example, I did a 14-week programme with cross-community women using drama, and these women were non-actors. So this was we spent a lot of time looking at themes and what was coming up. But the conversations when we were having a cup of tea, or the questions that they would ask, not in front of the group, would have been questions like, so where are you from? What school did you go to? And things like that. So yeah, but I would be very open at the beginning then. So learning that that's maybe an obstacle to getting people engaged and get the communication flowing. I would usually start off with who I am, where I came from. My father was Protestant, my mother was a Catholic. That's usually okay. So that's sort of a level ground. And I don't shirk away from any questions about what happened when I grew up and what I witnessed and how it made me feel. I have discussed that. I've had support, emotional support around all of those things as well. So I'm very open. So I think that then builds a rapport of trust, and people then maybe don't have all of those questions or trying to suss you out about what side are you on really? Because the drama piece was about the conflict, it turned out, and also about domestic violence. So the women brought those things to the table to explore through drama.
Well, I want to get back to the drama, and particularly about Sarah that you mentioned before. I think that's kind of interesting, because if different people could see themselves in Sarah, and they can envision what their lives would be like and or the challenges they might have.
Yeah, and Sarah I chose that name, intentionally, because it's sort of a name, and names are very important when people in this part of the world, in Northern Ireland, names can give so much away about what community you're from. So I thought long and hard about making the name that both communities could relate to. I spoke generally about things, not about addresses or places, but it was more about the show, not tell. So it was the show of the impact and the isolation that someone would feel being coerced by community and being coerced within a relationship. So I did a lot of hard thinking around how could this relate to everyone, because one little word, one little phrase could put one side of the community to close down and go, oh, this is about that other side, I'm not interested in watching this. And that's how subtle it can be.
And the name Sarah is not particularly a Catholic name or not particularly a Protestant name?
No. No.
That's really interesting. And then what about, and maybe this is a politically insensitive question, but what about men? Is it that men are you targeting women, or is it better if it's just women only in your experience?
No, just because my background was working with female victims of domestic and sexual violence and women who were trafficked for sexual exploitation, but my people I work with can be men and women. In fact, I would prefer it that way. So recently I did one where there was, I think, 30 people and there was about 15 men, which was great. So we do talk about domestic violence can happen to males as well, and all of those things were there. But I love it when the men in the audience then start to ask questions. They get the story and they start to ask really good, insightful questions. So it's difficult, but if you're a man and I'm there talking about male violence, and the majority of victims are female. But I think I've been doing this long enough now to, be sensitive around that, but also can't hide the facts. But I think I make it comfortable enough for men to be able to tolerate and hear this. Some men get really angry and go, this shouldn't be happening, we need to be doing more. So, as I say, the piece that I do is only one part of a bigger workshop. There has to be an introduction to where did this piece come from? Where did Sarah come from? And I would talk about the women that I've worked with over the years, the women I have seen in my community, and my own mother who suffered domestic violence. So Sarah's story is a culmination of all of those women. So even though it's a fiction as such, it's from real experiences and real people. And I think that could make a big impact. And then after the piece is over, we look and explore more what is coercive control and what can we do as a society to help tackle this.
And then in terms of society, does Ulster or any other university in Northern Ireland help the government to deal with some of these issues?
Yeah, similar to my answer in the course, we're in the society that's in conflict, and so a lot of our work would be about research which influences policy in the society. I myself would have spoken at a lot of sort of government committees, say around integrated education or around conflict-related issues. So we very much see ourselves as a civic institution, and in that sense, there's a commitment to communities, the types of people that Catherine is working with, but civic is also about our society. And so I would say pretty much across the board, most of the academics are involved in some sort of policy impact work at some level in this society.
If you're trying to train students to be peacemakers, what specifically skills are they going to have today that they didn't have yesterday that could be part of a future government reconciliation or societal reconciliation?
So, I mean, there are lots of different skills they're going to need. They're going to need skills of understanding and analytical skills, to understand the problems, as I alluded to earlier. I think in this society, because of the conflict, it at times became quite insular. So I think one of the things we do is also widen that out. Now, our student body has also changed. So we would have students from Nigeria or India or Sudan in the classroom. And so I think sometimes widening the perspective is quite important, so that the Northern Ireland conflict is not just about here, it's located in a global context. So I think that widening type aspect of knowledge would be something that we would focus on. And then a little bit of what we've been talking about, I don't know if we focus on it or if it just sort of happens, but everybody in the classroom is negotiating the conflict all the time. So they're all conscious of the language that they're using or who else is in the classroom. They might have to express their opinion about the political context, and they know it's different to the person next to them. And so they're developing those skills, and we're rarely aware of that. So we're not sort of pushing them on it, but often I feel that I'm sort of mediating a little bit in the classroom in a very subtle way, hopefully that the students don't even notice. So there's this third level of skills, which is about how you relate to those around you.
But also within our assignments, the critical thinking and stretching the muscles on the critical thinking, and the reflection piece. One of our first assignments is about reflection on about writing this piece and how does it make me feel, and about the learning and the applying the learning and the insight you get there. So that's what I use then, what I've learnt through this degree, is about how I can then apply that to my storytelling. So it's more informed, and also learning that you have to realise how your words fall on an audience or another person, and without referencing any particular writer or anything else, it becomes almost like information food, and then from that comes the language that I would need to be a better performer, as in to better articulate what's going on here as well. But I think the reflection and the critical thinking definitely helped us when we were doing our dissertations and things like that. And I chose intimate partner violence in a post-conflict society. So that was big learning for me after being a practitioner for over 20 years. But then looking at it from an academic side and a research side, I learned so much, and especially around how this topic of violence falls on others so that they're able to hear it. And I learned that through doing the degree.
Well, that is interesting, because the issue of being able to hear it is particularly interesting to me, because I suppose that just because you go into a class at Ulster University or any other university doesn't mean that your situation changed dramatically. The powerful is still the powerful, the people who are less powerful are still less powerful. But I suppose it's very hard to hear something you don't want to hear.
Yeah. And that's why drama then, and using poetic license and choosing music that you're playing can communicate right through that barrier, or that I can't tolerate this. So sometimes it's the music that I play like 2 minutes of music at the end from a local artist called Kaz Hawkins, who now lives in France, and she's a wonderful blues soul singer, and she tells the world and through her music that she suffered by living here in Northern Ireland with the conflict and domestic violence. So I use her music, and some people will say, wow, I was fine until you played that music, Catherine, and then it just broke me. So using all those forms, and I love that she's from here and that she's given me her blessing to use her music as well.
I think, what Catherine was saying about the self-reflection is important in terms of what you're saying about how you hear other voices. So I'd sort of forgotten that, actually, that the first assignment is really the question you asked me. The first assignment is, how do you define peace, and how do you locate yourself in how you understand it? So, some students might come at it from a religious perspective, some might come at it from a Marxist perspective, some might come from a more sort of liberal institutional perspective. And so we teach them all these different theories, and then we say, right, so where are you? And for us, that is the first step to how you hear other voices. You sort of have to know that I'm closed to hearing non-religious voices, or I'm closed to hearing more radical voices, or whatever it might be. So I'd sort of forgotten that's the first assignments are about locating locating yourself. And I've always found that the most helpful place to start, that when you start to have some of your self-awareness, you hear the other voices, I think, better.
But that's a really hard thing to do if you're not a calm person. What if you're a vigorous young student who believes in the cause?
Well, as I said, we're in a conflict society, so we have lots of students who do really believe in the cause, or a cause, whatever that cause might be. From my perspective is I don't try and dampen that. I would rather say, let's put that out there and let's find a way that we can hear all the different perspectives. And it works for us. Now, it might be a little bit the question you were asking to Catherine about who comes to the theatre. Now, maybe once you come to a master's level, you've already been through a process, so you're maybe a little bit more attuned to being with different people. But we have students from all over the world, and they do come with really strong opinions, and I encourage that. I actually think that's where the learning actually happens, not the other way around. So we're not trying to teach them all to, love the United Nations or this style of peacemaking. We're teaching people to make peace through critical engagement with the world. That's our philosophy. There are other schools that do it slightly differently, but that's how we do it. And I think we do it that way because we live here. I don't think we could do it any other way.
Thank you both for your time today. If you would like additional information about Ulster University, please go to ulster.ac.uk or silversisterproductions.com. If you'd like to send a note to me at the show, please go ahead and do so by sending an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Stephen Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.